Hello, is this thing on?
Do you think they can hear us?
Nah, let's say it again. Hi, and welcome to the Gritty Nurse Podcast, an unfiltered discussion related to health and healthcare. My name is Amie,
And my name is Sara.
and we are your podcast hosts.
If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, iHeartRadio, Amazon, or any other podcast listening platform, don't forget to subscribe so you can get updates to when we have our latest episodes. Also, don't forget to rate and review us.
And if you like what you're hearing and you love our advocacy work, don't forget to go to www.grittynurse.com and click on the donate button.
As little as $1 or $2 a month for a total of $12 a year will help us with our monthly podcast costs, such as website hosting, our hosting platform,
audio equipment, and the time and energy it takes us to put out good quality episodes. We thank you and we appreciate you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for listening to the Gritty Nurse Podcast. Today we have a great guest. We're going to be talking about some international, but also very pertinent national issues because you know what? We can't forget the work that we have to do in terms of partnering with others to improve health outcomes for all. So, Sara, how about you introduce our guest, please?
I am excited to welcome Dr. Jason Nickerson. He is the Humanitarian Affairs Advisor for Doctors Without Borders. Jason leads Doctors Without Borders work on humanitarian diplomacy and representation for the Government of Canada and provides advice on humanitarian operations, medical advocacy and policy, and access to medicines. Jason has over 10 years clinical experience as a respiratory therapist, working in adult critical care and anesthesia, and has worked extensively in global public health response in Canada and internationally during armed conflicts, disease epidemics, and sudden onset disasters. He is an internationally recognized expert on the legal tools for improving access to controlled medicines for pain relief, palliative care, and anesthesia in developing countries. Welcome, Jason. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
You're
Nice
like
to
a
be here.
jack of all trades. You do a lot of
Yeah,
cool
it's
stuff.
life's funny, right? I started my career as a respiratory therapist in practice for many, many years, but have found myself in this really interesting role with MSF. Yeah, healthcare is a wild place sometimes.
Yeah, so why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself and kind of how you started with Doctors Without Borders? Because I'm sure this is a really interesting topic for our listeners, and maybe some of them don't know what Doctors Without Borders does.
So, Doctors Without Borders, or Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF, we're a medical humanitarian organization. So we provide a pretty wide variety of medical care in over 70 countries around the world. So really, MSF teams are on the ground responding to disease epidemics, armed conflicts, natural disasters, forced displacement, a full variety of different humanitarian emergencies. And our teams do everything from community-based healthcare, public health, through to primary, secondary, and tertiary care. So our teams really traverse the whole spectrum of medical assistance, and all of the sort of supportive kinds of things that need to go into setting up a hospital or a health clinic. So that can be water and sanitation, that can be therapeutic feeding, a pretty diverse portfolio of things that need to be in place to be able to deliver healthcare. So it's a really fascinating area. It's an incredibly complex space to work in, as I'm sure you can imagine. It's a real privilege to be in a position like I am, where I'm the representative of all of this really wonderful work that's happening in the field, and really important work, and making sure that the voices of our patients and the needs of our patients are being communicated to decision makers and people who can enact some of the changes that need to happen in order to improve the health and well-being and dignity of people who are affected by crises.
And is there a particular story as to how you got started with Doctors Without Borders? Like, did you know someone, or was there like an aha moment there?
So I started my career as a respiratory therapist. So this goes back to the early 2000s. So I graduated from Dalhousie University. So I did my undergrad in respiratory therapy, and started practicing clinically first in Halifax, and then moved to Vancouver and worked at St. Paul's Hospital in downtown Vancouver, and then came to Ottawa. And along the way was doing grad studies. So I did a master's at UBC and then a PhD here in Ottawa. And really from early on in my clinical career, I knew that I wanted to have a focus on trying to close some of the gaps, initially clinical gaps that I saw, to improve access to health services for vulnerable and marginalized people who are so often systemically excluded from accessing health services. So initially, I was focusing on the health needs of vulnerable people, in Halifax and then in Vancouver. So did a lot of work with different organizations that were providing medical assistance to people who use drugs, and people experiencing homelessness. But then also had a real interest in global health. So initially had done some, sort of one-off short-term missions, but very quickly realized that we need to be looking at the systemic issues that are really in place that in many ways deny people access to the health services that they need,
Mhm.
right? And so early in kind of the 2010s, whatever we call that that decade, got really interested in issues related to access to medicines. So that sort of took me down a path of focusing on access to controlled medicines. So medicines for pain relief, palliative care, anesthetics, and so on, which I think most people don't realize. Analgesics, particularly opioids, are basically entirely inaccessible to billions of people around the world. So the problem is incredibly complex, but in a kind of nutshell, any controlled medicine is actually controlled by the same pieces of legislation that operate nationally and internationally to restrict access to illicit drugs. So
Okay.
in Canada, that's the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. So it actually has a dual mandate to restrict access to illicit drugs, but supposedly also to ensure access to controlled medicines. The problem is that the system is wildly complex, right? It's if you think of what happens in the hospital, and you're both nurses, so I'm sure you're very familiar with narcotic control sheets and all
Mhm.
of the accounting that goes into this.
Yeah.
So this is actually how hospitals comply with international drug control regulations, and countries are actually required to be able to demonstrate that they can track every single gram of a controlled substance from the point at which they order it to the point that it's either delivered or destroyed. So it's basically impossible for many countries that don't have functioning health infrastructure to comply with these requirements. So there's a massive unmet need for pain medicines that exists around the world. And I just find that personally offensive, in a really significant way. And so that took me down this path of trying to do some useful work to improve access to controlled medicines. And along the way, I'd done quite a bit of health systems work in humanitarian emergencies, initially in Haiti and then in Darfur. And through that path over many years, ended up at MSF in 2015 in this role. So that's a bit of a long explanation of how somebody ends up as a humanitarian affairs advisor for MSF in Canada. But I think the short answer is, you build a solid foundation for understanding complex problems and just kind of live and work in the world doing good things for long enough, and you kind of build an interesting portfolio of expertise to be able to speak to a lot of different complicated problems and hopefully find some solutions to them.
Yeah, that's entirely amazing, and I had an aha moment myself where I was kind of like, I think we understand like from our hospital setting in terms of like the controlled act, but not knowing how far it actually reaches to the fact that it's actually disadvantaging a whole subset of people. And we already know, like for example, we're actually going to have Dr. Aliga LaFontaine on our
Hmm.
podcast because he's now the CMA president, but also is an anesthesiologist. And we were actually going to just talk about pain and just be like, we know that there's systemic issues in relation to how people are being treated or monitored, or have, like, how they actually access medications when it comes to pain. And even just hearing that like, there are whole countries that just don't have access. I think even for me, I didn't even recognize that in itself as a part of the problem. So I think even for me now, it's just like, okay, we have even more work to do, Sarah, in terms of our own understanding of like how far this really goes. It's mind-boggling that, we say, we're a first world country, we're solving problems, and it's like, wow, we're not even scratching the surface. This is really messed up.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to all collectively realize that, like, there are really significant systemic barriers to accessing health services that exist around the world, right? And we can take that down a number of different paths, but if we stay on the issue of access to medicines, the rules of the game are written in a way that does not allow billions of people around the world to have timely and affordable access to life-saving and effective treatments that they actually need. And whether that's a vaccine to prevent somebody from getting sick in the first place, or whether that's a treatment for a disease that is treatable, or whether that's palliative care that is essential for
Yeah.
managing pain at the end of life and ensuring patient dignity. There are real significant systemic barriers in the way that we discover, develop, and distribute medicines that significantly disadvantage billions of people on this planet, and that's just something that we need to fix.
God.
Mm-hmm.
That's a whole other podcast episode. Like, I just
Yeah.
like that. Oh my god, that's a whole other episode that we definitely might have to have you come back to talk about.
Yeah.
But talking about equity, talking about accessibility, could you tell us a little bit more about the petition to ensure that medicines are developed with public funds are actually accessible, affordable, and available to those who need it, to people who don't have the access, don't have the right where they should have the right now.
Yeah. So I think that one of the things that most of us working in healthcare don't really understand, again, because it's incredibly complicated, is where do the medicines that we use actually come from?
Mm-hmm.
And the pathway is the pathway for drug development is complicated. There's no doubt about that. It takes a tremendous amount of time. It's all of the things. The reality is that most drugs, and in the United States, this is particularly true, where 100% of the drugs in the United States over the last decade originate with some form of public funding. So what that means in Canada, for example, is that we have a Canadian Institutes of Health Research and other funding mechanisms as well that provide funding to researchers to do medical research of all varieties. But part of that is research and development into new medicines, new vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, medical devices, and so on. And often that funding is truly the backbone of new discoveries, right, for things
Right.
that we need. And that's great. That's entirely appropriate. We should have more of that. We should have more public funding that's going into doing drug discovery and drug development. The problem with the way that the world does this is that funding goes out the door without any strings attached to it,
Mm.
right? So in Canada, we spend about $1 billion a year through CIHR to do medical research and development that leads to, as I say, new medicines, new vaccines, new diagnostic tests, and so on. But that funding actually doesn't require anybody to ensure that when those new technologies come onto the market, that they are going to be affordable, that they're going to be accessible, or even that they're going to be registered for use in any particular country.
Right.
So we actually don't demand anything in exchange for this. And that doesn't make very much sense, is
No.
ultimately what it boils down to.
That's a lot of
Um,
money too.
it's a lot of money. And, it's a real missed opportunity that has real significant consequences. So, in particular, for our patients who, by and large, are in low and middle income countries, these are places where, particularly low income countries, that are not viewed by the pharmaceutical industry as being profitable enough for them to, quite frankly, be bothered to launch new medicines there. So they're often, again, systematically excluded from accessing new life-saving medicines because companies simply choose to not make them available in these places. And when a drug or a vaccine has its origins in public funding, meaning that taxpayers,
Right.
all of us, have paid for its discovery, I think that's simply unacceptable, right? We should be demanding that there are
Mhm.
global access conditions that are included in this $1 billion that goes out the door every year, and south of the border in the United States, it's much larger than that. Um, we have a broken research and development system that today is producing life-saving drugs, certainly, but they're coming with unreasonably high price tags,
Right.
hundreds of thousands of
Mhm.
dollars per
Mhm.
patient per year. And those same drugs are not being made available at anything that would resemble an affordable price for patients in low and middle income countries. So, we've been working on this issue for close to 50 years now. I mean, we have seen our patients being systematically excluded from accessing life-saving treatments for decades. And we've launched individual campaigns to push for access to antiretrovirals for HIV, to push for access to the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine for childhood pneumonia, many other drugs and vaccines in a very specific way. But ultimately, this is a systemic problem,
Right.
right? We
Right.
need to rewrite the rules of the game because it's not just a case of one or two drugs that are not accessible and affordable for patients. It's a case of virtually all medicines that are new to the market, if you want to speak in those terms, are largely inaccessible to patients. So what we launched last year was a petition to the Canadian government that really aligned with COVID-19, which really shone a light, I think, on how this
Yeah.
system works. The Canadian government opened more than $1 billion of public funding specifically for COVID-19
Hmm.
therapeutics, vaccines,
Hmm.
and diagnostics. So again, really, de-risking and directly subsidizing the R&D. And we asked for the Canadian government to start including common sense public health safeguards into this funding. So demand that in exchange for the billions of dollars that we spend on public funding, that companies price new medicines, new vaccines affordably,
Right.
um, guarantee and ensure that they're going to be accessible for use in low and middle income countries, and generally take actions that are going to ensure that they're accessible for patients and for health systems to be able to access them. And there's a lot of different ways that can be done. I don't think that there's sort of a cookie cutter, one size fits all solution to this, but we need to try, right? We
Yeah.
can't continue
Mhm.
going down
Absolutely.
the same road that we're on. And I think that this is common sense. We need to be safeguarding access to medicines that we're all paying to develop. And I think that for most Canadians, it would be completely unacceptable that Canadian taxpayers and the Canadian government would pay to discover and develop a new medicine that could save somebody's life or stop them from getting sick, and that would be priced out of reach for people who need it. I think all of us would agree that that's an unacceptable outcome.
Oh,
I
absolutely.
completely agree with you. I feel like the way um that it's packaged and the way that people I don't think people think about it the way that like we're thinking about it. This is a moral and ethical problem, right? And I guess if I was to play devil's advocate, thinking about from like a pharmaceutical company, well, why would they want to make some like where would they make money if they made it accessible, right? But obviously that's what the problem is. Like the problem is with big pharma. It's the fact that, it is pharmaceuticals are multi-billion dollar industry and it's like, well, most people who go into pharmacy is to make money. But the thing is, there is that inherently moral and ethical problem where it's just like, okay, well, there are people dying that can't actually afford this or can't actually access
Yeah.
this, but they're putting people's lives on the line all the time. And I think people just don't actually recognize, and I'm
Hmm.
glad that we're having this conversation. They don't actually recognize what is actually happening with the money that, we are publicly putting into this type of work. And it's I
Hmm.
think when I keep on thinking about the systems, it's like there's always a certain subset of people, and I'm not gonna like point at any one particular person, but these systems are built to keep poor people poor and rich people rich, right? Like, I mean, it's just set that way. Like, I don't understand how we are still living in a like in a era where, people don't have access to fresh water. Even here in Canada, there are people that still don't have
Yeah.
access to clean water, and it's just like, what are we doing? We all need to kind of give ourselves a real head shake and say, okay, what are we actually doing to make people accountable for the actions that they have in terms of like what's happening here. And I think that accountability structure is hugely important. And I think this petition that you have out there is hugely important because we need to hold people accountable for our where our money is going. It's like, and I agree with you. Hundreds of thousands of Canadians, millions of Canadians would be like, yeah, we want people out there to be able to get the medicine and the treatment that they need, especially that, we're putting our money towards that. And it's just, I think this is
Yep.
just a hugely important conversation to have, and I think it's going to be eye opening for a lot of different people as well.
Yeah, and us being a first world country, and then everyone else is, that's not a first world country is sort of left. They're just left behind. And I think that even within Canada, we're not all able to access the same medications, right? So there are certain groups that are vulnerable and they've been marginalized. For example, First Nations, the homeless, a lot of people that have been able to access the medications available in our own country. And Canada, I feel like there is work to be done in terms of making medicines accessible to everyone. And you may have heard recently that our provincial government voted down universal pharmacare, which would really have helped a lot of individuals. And is that surprising to you, or what are your thoughts on that?
So, I mean, I think if we step back, it comes back to what we were talking about before, right? Like we've been going down this road of sort of business as usual as it relates to access to medicines and the way that pharmaceuticals are discovered, developed, made accessible to people. And I think that there's a real challenge to convince policymakers that there is an alternative, right?
Right.
And that's true whether we're talking about research and development or whether we're talking about national pharmacare or whatever it may be. Um, I think that increasingly policymakers are waking up to the reality that the path we are on is unsustainable, right? We
Yeah.
cannot continue to have new medicines for every disease that is out there that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars per patient per year
Yeah.
or millions of dollars per patient. I mean, it's just simply unaffordable, and it's unsustainable. Um, and there's really no rationale for why drugs need to be priced so excessively, right? Like we need a little bit of perspective here,
Yeah.
um, in the sense that the pharmaceutical industry is the most profitable industry
Yep.
on the planet, period.
Hmm.
Um, and it's not to get into a conversation about should companies and individuals be allowed to profit and so on. That's a really complicated space.
Yeah.
But the reality is that prices are unaffordable for patients and for health systems, and that is depriving people in every country around the world today of access to the treatments that they need. So we need different approaches to how medicines are being developed, discovered, manufactured, and purchased. In Canada, I mean, I'm not saying anything new when I say that we're the only country that claims to have universal healthcare that doesn't have a national pharmacare scheme,
Right.
Right.
or system. I think the evidence is quite clear that like this comes with consequences, right?
Right.
There are people in Canada who delay refilling prescriptions or filling prescriptions in the first place, do not have access to the medicines that they need, and that harms people, right? I mean, this is unacceptable. People should have access to the treatments that they need, and it's just ludicrous, frankly, that they don't. So we need some kind of solution to this problem. I mean, it's completely unnecessary that there are life-saving or life-prolonging medicines that exist that people can't access. There's no need for that at all.
Yeah, and I mean, I know this sounds horrible, but it's like you can't if we don't see it, we don't see it, so we're not bothered to talk about it, right? So it's like, well, that homeless person or whatever that, whatever that problem is over there, it's not my problem. And it's like, yeah, actually it is your problem. But a lot of it is, some people don't find it tangible. They can't find it relatable. And it's not like, okay, well, that's a huge issue, right? And it's not that we should be throwing it in,
Yep.
well, no, maybe we should be throwing it in people's faces to say, hey, look what's happening over here. um these issues when it comes to equity and healthcare. Like I actually put a tweet this week because there was like a company I saw, it was like called Go Forward or something, and they're talking about like they're the new way forward in terms of advancing healthcare, advancing medicine. So my first question was like, how are you ensuring that this program that you're making is equitable? And if it's not equitable, then it's not transformative. Like, I mean, that doesn't make any sense. Like, you have to make sure that you're ensuring that there's equity a part of the work that you're doing, or it's not going to transform how healthcare looks. I see it on a daily basis in terms of people coming in to, especially within the emergency departments, people coming in at the very last moment. And I think it goes to speak where people say, oh, Canada's so different from the United States. Well, no, we're not. I still see people accessing the emergency department on their, like, pretty much on their dying bed when they shouldn't be accessing it at that point because they don't have access
Yep.
to being able to pay for their medicines, or they haven't
Mhm, mhm.
they don't have access to a primary care provider, or their care hasn't been looked after through this entire trajectory, so we get to see them at the very last minute. And then again, like that access to pain medication and various different things, it's a huge cyclical, horrifying cycle that we're putting a certain subset of people through. And I think we need to let people know that this is
Yep.
something that's completely unacceptable, and we have to continue to call it out and talk about it, because there's got to be a better way than what we're doing right now. Because what we're doing, like you said, it's not working. We need to look at
Yep.
better solutions. Sarah and I say, we're always solution focused, because people say there are all these problems, but we don't come with tangible solutions. So what are some, and I'm kind of
Mhm.
diverging a little bit here, but what are some of the tangible solutions you foresee in terms of making some meaningful change and seeing better health outcomes for people who are marginalized or underrepresented?
Sure. So I want to go back to just one of the things that you
Hmm.
said, which is, that there is this moral imperative, right, to improve access to medicines, and I think it came up when we were talking specifically about calls to include safeguards in the way that we actually fund the development of new medicines, and I completely agree. I mean, there's absolutely a moral obligation to do this. I think if we want to flip it to sort of the more economics kind of conversation, I mean, the way that we develop new medicines right now is just bad business
Yeah.
too, right? Like there is not a company in the world today that would pay to discover, like an essential piece of technology, who would then just license it to somebody else,
Right.
like no strings attached,
Right.
saying like, look, okay, we know we're going to need this, but we're not actually going to negotiate that at this point. We'll just pay the high price on the other end, right? Like
Right.
that is what governments are doing right now. We're paying twice. We're paying to
Right.
discover something, and then we're paying a high price for that
Mhm.
same technology when it comes onto the market. And that's resulting in poor access, which I think is a moral failure, but is also just bad business. So to get to your question of like, what is it that we need to do differently? We actually have good examples of how to do this differently, right? So, to give you just one example, MSF in the early 2000s was one of the co founders of an organization called the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative, which is a not for profit pharmaceutical research and development company, basically a not for profit pharmaceutical company. And DNDI was created to focus specifically on a group of diseases called neglected tropical diseases. So this is diseases like Chagas, leishmaniasis, sleeping sickness, and others, but also to develop new formulations of drugs for diseases like pediatric HIV, because there was
Wow. Yeah.
essentially no commercial interest in developing pediatric formulations of
Wow.
antiretrovirals. So DNDI, they call themselves the conductor of the symphony, in the sense that it's what's called a product development partnership. So they bring different actors together in industry and academia and government and so on, and have said, particularly for neglected tropical diseases, there's essentially a market failure. So how do we overcome that, right? Like, how do we incentivize the kind of research and development that we need to develop new treatments for sleeping sickness is a great example. Because about 20 years ago, we treated sleeping sickness with a drug that killed 1 in 20 people who were
Wow.
administered it. It was basically an arsenic derivative that was dissolved in antifreeze and was
Wow.
described by patients
So
as,
long.
fire in the blood.
Oh my god.
So, this is not a good treatment, but there is basically no commercial interest in solving this problem, because it's not profitable, or
Right. I
wasn't
was gonna
viewed
say
as
it's not
being
going to make them any
profitable.
money.
Yeah. So DNDi took this on, and has essentially transformed the treatment landscape, by bringing together all of the partners and saying from the get-go, we are going to develop treatments in patients' interests, right? We're going to be led by public health priorities. We're going to attach conditions onto any agreements that we enter into. Anybody participating in this process needs to agree that the final product is going to be affordable, accessible, priced reasonably, and so on, right? It's principle and public health needs driven R&D. And
Right.
it worked. They managed to develop a new drug, fexinidazole, that received regulatory approval a couple of years ago. It's an all oral treatment. It's highly effective, and radically transformed the way that we treat sleeping sickness today. And there's other examples and so on. The point is that you need to start from this place of being public health needs based and principle driven, right? You need
Right.
to bring the actors to the table, to say, look, we are here to solve health problems, and to develop new medicines, and new health technologies that are going to address our patients' needs. And the goal here is to make those as accessible to people who need them as possible. And I think that governments and universities, and other research and development organizations have this ability, right? They have the ability to bring
Hmm.
people around the table, and get them to commit to doing the kind of drug development work, that needs to be done in a timely manner. It can be efficient, and deliver affordable and accessible products. This is not a pipe dream. There are
Right.
organizations that are out there that are
Yeah.
actively doing this, and we've got good models of how to do it. But we, ultimately have to climb out of our sort of entrenched way of doing things, and we also have to recognize that, like, it's not just pharmaceutical companies who have to develop drugs.
Right.
I have a colleague who says repeatedly, like, it's not a law of physics that pharmaceutical companies need to be developing new medicines, and in fact, they're probably not the best ones to be doing it.
Right.
So, ultimately, I think we need governments and other partners to come around to this idea that, like, actually universities, and others can play a pretty significant role in being the conductor of the symphony, if you will. But it's a different approach to drug development, and it needs to include very clear and enforceable safeguards that protect and ensure patient access, over private profits. It's ultimately what it comes down to.
Yeah, see, like, I think in Canada, that's an easier conversation to have. I feel like, in terms of our government's understanding and working towards seeing some sustainable change, I feel like here, I feel like people will listen. um, the US, I feel, is like a whole other entity in itself. We did a
Well, I think.
yeah, go ahead. No, go
Sorry,
ahead.
go ahead. No, I was going to say. I mean, I think that COVID, in a way, is shining a light on
Yes, I was gonna
this,
say I agree.
though, right?
Hmm.
Particularly with vaccines right now, we're in a situation of extremely high need and high demand,
Yeah.
um, and limited supply. And when we look at COVID vaccines, I mean, the public has de-risked significant amounts of the research and development and manufacturing of these vaccines.
Right.
And yet, very few governments have managed to secure and negotiate, security of supply for one, or any global access provisions to ensure that these vaccines are going to be accessible to everyone on the planet who needs one.
Yeah.
Right.
Um, and
Right.
again, that's just it's bad public health to have not done this in the first place, right? This is a global pandemic. I think that it's absolutely a moral imperative
Right.
that we
I agree.
ensure access to COVID vaccines for everyone uh, who needs one, which today is 100% of the global
Everybody.
population.
Yeah.
Um, it would be a moral failure to have an inequity in COVID vaccines, but it's also just bad public health, right?
Absolutely.
The system as it's functioning today, that is allowing individual companies to decide how many batches of vaccines and how many doses get produced and where and who gets first access and so on. I mean, it's an inequity in action
Yeah.
is what it is,
Absolutely.
but
Mhm.
it's an inequity and bad public health that's allowed to happen because the rules of the game are written in such a way that allow for that. And I
Right.
think countries are waking up to this reality and realizing that you know, we should have included additional protections, additional safeguards, additional global access demands in the billions of dollars that went out the door to subsidize and de-risk this R&D and manufacturing. And hopefully they're going to wake up and try and have additional influence, not just for COVID, but for
For
all
next.
of
Yeah.
the R&D that
Mhm. Mhm.
happens in the future, because it's not just a COVID problem,
Nope.
right? This is
Absolutely
this
not.
is a much bigger problem than that, unfortunately. But not to focus too much on the problems, as you were saying. I mean, there's good examples out there of ways that we can solve this problem. Um, and I think all of us working in the system, we need to wrap our heads around what some of those solutions are, and also have a good understanding of what the problems truly are, and just how deeply entrenched they are in the systems of medical research and development and drug manufacturing and distribution. It's a complicated space, but those of us who work in clinical care, we're administering and using new medicines and drugs
Mhm.
as part of our
Mhm.
patient care every single day. So I think it's important that we have an understanding of where they come from, and what some of the challenges are around them.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the general public, they view developing medicines as, the answer, right? But they don't realize that there are all these layers of bureaucracy around that. So developing it is one thing, right? But it's like, how do we get it to the people that actually need it? And usually the people that are in greatest need are the ones that are most disadvantaged. And I feel even the same way with the COVID vaccine. I know that the first world countries have been buying up so many doses. I read somewhere that Canada has pre-purchased something like 400 million doses of the vaccine, which is enough to vaccinate everyone 10 times over. But where do developing countries kind of fall into that spectrum, right? Like, we just need to be aware of that as well when we're in a position of privilege.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at this moment, high income countries have effectively monopolized
absolutely. Yep.
uh, the available doses of COVID vaccines. And I think, to be really clear, Canada is vaccinating high risk people today, and it's entirely appropriate that frontline healthcare workers and other vulnerable people in Canada be vaccinated. Right? That's what we need to be doing. But we need to be doing that on a global scale, right?
Yeah.
We need to be
Absolutely.
ensuring priority access to COVID vaccines for healthcare workers, not just in Canada, not just in the United States, but in Mali, in
Yep.
Mozambique, in Malawi, in Iraq, in all of these places, right? I mean, there is COVID there,
Yep.
and there are health systems that have been overwhelmed, and we need to be prioritizing globally, not just within our own borders. The people who are most at risk and who are most vulnerable of either contracting COVID in the first place or
Yep.
developing severe forms of the disease. And it's, we're all impatient. We all want
Yep.
access to COVID vaccines. We all want our friends and families and parents and everyone to have access to COVID vaccines. But we need to be prioritizing at a global level the people who need to be at the front of the line, and that's just simply not a place for nationalism and vaccine hoarding and so on, right? Uh, it's an inequity in action in front of our very eyes that we have countries that have secured enough doses of COVID vaccines to, as you say, vaccinate the entire population 10 times over. But at the same time, there are countries who are only in the past couple of weeks starting to receive their first shipments of vaccines, and that won't be enough to vaccinate their at-risk populations
Hmm.
at all. I mean, it's a real problem that we've got on our hands here.
No, I wholeheartedly agree. And I think even just to kind of sum this up, it's like we actually have to just not be selfish assholes and actually look out for other people other than ourselves, right? No, like I mean, if you're boiling it down to its nuts and bolts, it's like, we like look at me. I get to sit in this lovely house. I've had my first dose. I wouldn't be consider myself as a frontline worker, but like I'm a nurse and I've had my first dose. And I have these luxuries afforded to me where there are people who are greater at who are at greater risk of getting COVID-19 than me, and they might not even be seeing a vaccine till like December or further. We have to do better in terms of how we are protecting people who are most vulnerable, who are marginalized, who are kind of pushed by society to the fringes. And I think we just need to stop being selfish and do a better job. And like you said, we need to make sure that we're looking at equitable access on a global scale, not just on a national or provincial scale. And I think that we miss the mark so many times. And we just have to start thinking about doing this differently. And I think health equity has to always be at the forefront of how we're going to make sure that access to healthcare is sustainable, and that we'll see better outcomes for not just ourselves, but the people that we care the most about. So like I could tell you, myself and Sarah, we're here for it all day, but we need to let other people know. And hopefully through this podcast, we can continue to get the message out to say, it's not just us in our little bubble. We got to think way broader than what we're thinking
Yeah,
about today.
absolutely.
So do you have
It's a
any?
global pandemic, right? And
Absolutely.
like none of us are happy about being in this situation
Nope.
at all.
1 year and
Um,
counting.
yeah,
Seriously.
one year, 1 year and counting, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I think that we're realizing, like, I agree with you completely. I mean, health equity needs to be the lens that we view all of this through. Um, but the way in which we develop and manufacture new vaccines, I think, is very clear. It is inequitable, right? Like
Absolutely.
the
Yeah.
system is not set up to facilitate global equitable access to
Yeah.
new health technologies. That is what we are seeing in fast motion in front of us right now. And so, we're probably talking about a really significant reform of the way that we manufacture um, new health products and health technologies, right? We've got concentrated manufacturing that was not able to rapidly scale up to produce enough vaccine doses to meet global demand. So we're going to have to figure out how we do this, right? I mean, this is not a one and done pandemic.
No.
Right? I mean, there are there's pathogens with pandemic potential that exist
Yeah.
outside of COVID. So, we need to find ways uh, of fixing the R&D and manufacturing problem, just as a matter of global pandemic preparedness and response. But as I say, we can't just leave it at pandemics. I mean,
Yeah.
there are massive access issues for drugs for tuberculosis, for HIV, for hepatitis C, for pain relief, palliative care. I mean, these are major problems that we need to be fixing, and we shouldn't just focus on one slice of the problem. We need to really take a hard look at the whole complicated, messy system that the world has created over the past decades for developing and delivering new medicines. And we need a rethink to prioritize access and affordability and equity over profits, which is what's been driving things up until now.
I agree with you. Let's take on our governments because we have to hold them accountable. No, we have to. Like you took those signatures to Minister Haidu, and
Yep.
they need to they do need to do better, and they need to recognize that there's these issues, and that we're not going to go away. We're going to keep talking
Yeah,
about them.
and 91,000 people signed that petition, right? This is not an
Amazing.
insignificant number of people. This is a 91,000 people who agree, and I think that it's. I mean, in many ways, it's a common sense proposition,
Right.
right? Like medicines need to be affordable and accessible for people who need them. Period.
Absolutely. So what's happening with that? What's the next step?
Well, we're continuing to talk to the government about this. I've appeared before Standing Committee on Health a couple of times now. We've appeared before the Finance Committee. We're really trying to demonstrate that this is an issue that Canadians care about, and that there are viable, practical solutions to this problem. Like there is a path forward for the government to take on this. So we're trying to make sure that we're, you know, sharing the examples of how to actually do this and talking to policymakers about it. But we're going to continue to make noise about this in Canada and internationally. We're going to try and really focus in on a few kind of vaccines and medicines to really clearly illustrate this problem and this example. So in Canada, there there is an Ebola vaccine that, as you may know, was discovered at the National Microbiology Lab in Winnipeg in the early 2000s. It's a great example of groundbreaking work that's been done in the public sector. That vaccine was licensed to a private company in the early 2010s, sat on a shelf until the 2014 West Africa outbreak, and then, basically under a massive amount of public need and public pressure, was licensed to Merck and finally got to the finish line a couple of years ago. So, we're looking at some of these examples to say, like, look, there's probably a better way that we could have done this.
Right.
That vaccine today is being stockpiled. There's a global stockpile that will have, enough doses to hopefully respond to Ebola outbreaks in the future, but it's coming at a very high price.
Right.
If we kind of
Hmm.
do the math on what's been publicly reported, it's about $98
Yeah,
per
I
dose, I
remember.
think, is what it works out to. So, I mean, this is really a massively high price
Yeah.
for a global health vaccine. But we're trying to focus in and to say, look, there's good science that's happening that we need governments to be paying attention to, and not just simply licensing this stuff out the door to a private company without demanding anything in exchange. And the Ebola vaccine is, again, maybe a good example. That the Ebola vaccine that was discovered in Canada is actually not registered for use in Canada.
Yeah, yeah.
So
That's kind of
I was gonna
ironic.
say,
right, and I
well,
mean, you can make the argument, okay, that Canada is unlikely to have an Ebola outbreak anytime soon. That's fine, but I think COVID shows we live in a globalized world, right? And cases of infectious diseases can
can come.
cross
Yeah.
borders pretty quickly. So it's just one of these examples of, like, a bit of the ridiculousness of it all. Of like, we discovered a vaccine that is not registered for use in the country that paid to discover it in the
Yep.
first place. So yeah, I mean, we'll continue to really push this message home. It's important. We can do better. I think Canadians should demand that our
Yes.
government does better. And yeah, we're not going away anytime soon, because our patients need affordable access to life-saving medicines. And I think that we all have a moral responsibility to keep pushing for the kind of change that's going to deliver it.
Yeah. You
Hmm.
can't put a price on someone's life. Doesn't
Yeah,
matter.
absolutely.
You can't. So I agree. And then I we won't get into this today, but I mean, we definitely need to talk about, like, why does Canada not make our own vaccines? And I did some research and I was just like, "Oh my god, what are we thinking? What's
Sure.
happening here? Like, why can't we make our own COVID-19 vaccine?" And then I did my homework and I was like, "What's happening? Like, what's happening in
It's
the world?"
complicated. Oh, for sure. But I think that there's a fascinating conversation to be had there about, if Canada is going to invest in biomanufacturing capacity, like what are the things that we think, a publicly funded manufacturing facility should be producing, right? We can actually
Yes,
solve quite a bit of problems
I
if we
agree.
take profit motivation out of the equation.
It just started even with the masks. Like, why weren't we able to procure enough N95 at the beginning of the pandemic? So it's like we
Yeah.
just need to have that conversation about being more self sufficient. But I wanted to thank you today, Dr. Jason Nickerson, for having this conversation with us. It was really eye opening and insightful. I think it sheds a lot of um, a lot of the issues that are in the media. It's been really interesting to hear your side of the story, and I know this will be really valuable for our listeners.
Yeah, I think
Oh, my pleasure.
it'll give some really good perspective.
Yeah, just talking about Doctors Without Borders, MSF, I think it's been really informative for us.
Oh, well, thanks so much for having me.
Where can people find you and all the great work that you're doing? Where can we point our listeners to?
So you can check out the MSF website, which is doctorswithoutborders.ca. You can find me on Twitter offering some hot takes I'm at JW Nickerson, I think is my handle.
Awesome. Thank you so much for
Awesome.
coming on.
Thanks so much. It was nice chatting with you.